Hello, I'm Thomas Summers. We humans have always been adept at one task in particular: death. If there's a way to die, we found it. That being said, there's also no one better at respecting death, either. Archaeologists have discovered graves as old as 78,000 years with human remains that have been carefully prepared. This proves even ancient humans had their own set of rites for burying their dead. And this goes double for ancient civilizations. Every culture did, and still does, have their own special sets of rites and rituals. Some grandiose and impressive, some pretty much digging a hole and saying a prayer. It's a sick, masochistic relationship we can't get enough of, and I'm here to tell you all about it. This is funerals, the busiest stage of death. And when talking about funerals, no one comes to mind more than the high-class Egyptians. When they passed, their bodies would be mummified and a tomb would be built for them. When both were complete, the mummy would be wrapped, put in a coffin, or even multiple coffins at once. Then, they'd be taken back to their home. Here, the funeral procession would start. The coffin would be put on a sledge and then dragged to the tomb by oxen. As the coffin was dragged, the family would walk behind it. The men would shave and the women would tear their clothing and rub dirt on themselves to show they were mourning. Sometimes they would hire professional mourners, whose job was just to act super sad behind the coffin. And then behind the mourners would be the servants carrying all the stuff the deceased would be buried with. Sometimes they would have musicians or dancers as well. Once they arrived at the tomb, the coffin was placed upright by a priest dressed as Anubis, and the lector priest read prayers and spells from a scroll. Two women, usually relatives, would kneel next to the coffin, singing funeral songs. Then, the funeral rites would begin. These would be performed by priests and the sons of the deceased. The most important ritual was the opening of the mouth ritual, in which spells would be read and the eyes, ears, nose, and mouth would be touched with ritual objects. After this was the offering ritual, where clothes and food would be offered to the deceased. Then, the family would have a feast, either inside or near the tomb, and then afterwards the coffin would be placed in the burial chamber and the tomb would be sealed. I'm sure you've also heard of Viking funerals, where the dead would be set out on a boat, then a flaming arrow would light it on fire, igniting the ship. Well, it's not true. However, many Vikings did cremate their dead, and some actually were buried with entire boats to help with their passage to the afterlife. It wasn't common, of course, since boats are huge and useful, but it happened. They'd even build giant grave mounds shaped like ships. The funerals themselves would be boisterous, happy occasions full of drinking, food, and songs. Well, happy for the Vikings, they also had some very unique funeral customs that we're not going to go over because they are a bit too much for this show. There's also the good old days in the USA. Back in the day, we'd basically just set up the corpse in the living room, say our goodbyes, then bury him in the backyard when we're done. Nowadays, though, you gotta pay for the funeral home, the mortician, the casket, the wake, and the median cost for a traditional funeral now is $7,848. How did we get here? Well, the shift can be traced back to the American Civil War. On May 24th, 1861, Colonel Elmer Ellsworth was shot and killed on top of a building in Virginia for removing a Confederate flag. This was the first death of the Civil War, and like a knight in shining armor, one man offered his services to the Ellsworth family: Thomas Holmes. He preserved the colonel's body and it was taken to New York City, where thousands lined up to view it and get hyped up to fight the South. This made for a particularly convenient time for embalmers, especially Holmes, who invented his own embalming fluid, which he sold for $3 a gallon. As Americans died, it meant more money for them, since no one wants a half-decayed corpse sent back home. Many corpses would be embalmed for $25 a pop for the normal soldiers and nearly double that for officers. That's nearly $700 by today's standards, and no one likes to be told, "Hi, your son is dead, $700 for his body in good condition." So, because of this, many embalmers would set up tents near battle sites and offered soldiers to prepay to be embalmed. These guys would make bank, and at one point Ulysses S. Grant even had to shoo them away because they were affecting morale. Thomas Holmes alone claimed to embalm nearly 4,000 bodies over the course of the war. In embalming shops, he displayed the preserved bodies of unknown soldiers he collected from battlefields. Embalming was the hip new craze, and the final nail in the coffin was the death of Lincoln. After he died, they embalmed his body and sent him on a train from Washington, D.C. all the way to Springfield, Illinois over the course of 3 weeks, with public viewing stopped at the cities throughout. The body was in rough shape by the end thanks to the lack of refrigeration, but overall the experience only made Americans more excited to die than ever. So, this triggered the beautification of death, a movement in American culture that moved funerals away from the simple place him in a coffin and bury him in the backyard and towards the complex open casket and beautiful tombstone. Death wasn't just a part of life anymore, it was the last hurrah, a final send-off, and the American widow's wallet would never be the same. Also, bonus fact, Thomas Holmes ended up sharing his house in Brooklyn with some of his works. That's right, he'd put embalmed bodies in closets and heads on tables. For some reason, he never married, and ended up going insane. Before he died, he requested not to be embalmed. Knowing how he got here is nice and all, but for a good number of you out there, I'm sure you've never actually been to a funeral before. So, I'm going to give you the lowdown on an average American funeral and teach you the terminology you'll need to be prepared. So, first things first is the wake. The wake is held before the funeral, and it's usually a pretty casual event where the body is present. Sometimes it's a few days before the funeral, sometimes it's right before. Open casket means the body is visible, and closed casket means the body isn't. After the wake is the funeral service. It's usually held in a large room, like maybe a small church or a large one, but in the main area with all the pews. The body is moved to the front and there may be songs, prayers, or a lot of rambling. It depends on the funeral. There are funeral programs given out that detail the schedule, especially of this part. At some point there's the eulogy, which is usually an overview of their life and moments the speaker may have shared. After the service is finished, the procession begins. In the procession, attendees will either drive or ride to the burial plot, followed behind the hearse, which is a special vehicle that holds the casket. Once everyone arrives, the burial service starts. The burial service begins by having the pallbearers carry the casket and place it on the casket lowering device. The pallbearers also traditionally carry the casket from the funeral service to the hearse. After this, a short ceremony is held and the coffin is lowered into the ground, and finally is the funeral reception, where everyone comes together to eat afterwards. Now, this may all seem complicated, but that's nothing when you consider the fact that all of this is just the most stripped down version of what an American funeral is, and some parts may be taken out, some may be added, and this is all assuming they're being buried instead of cremated, and there are hundreds of little details and differences that take place. So, best rule of thumb is if you're attending a funeral and you're unsure of what to do, ask the guy next to you. I've been discussing the history and semantics of funerals, but of course there's so much more to them than that. Regardless of how or where they're done, funerals are a chance for those closest to pay their respects, mourn over their loss. The funeral is for them, not anyone else, not even the one who died. Grief is a terrible, heart-wrenching thing, but at the end of the day, we wouldn't be human if death wasn't difficult. I've picked up this little guy from Walmart to give you a more intimate experience with cacti. I didn't really make this video because I was interested in funerals. To be frank, they terrify me. But it's my fault he's dead. After I filmed cacti, I transferred him from his pot to a larger one. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I didn't. He was fine for a while, but he started graying on his right arm. I figured maybe he just wasn't getting enough water or something, but it went from bad to worse in about 2 days. I did another pot transfer, competently, this time, hoping I could save him, but it was too late. It's my fault he's gone. I know it's silly to even compare his death to that of a loved one or a family member, but I had a lot of history with him, and I felt like I needed to give him a proper send-off. People move on in their own ways, and some people never fully do. I'm lucky my loss was so small, I couldn't even imagine what I'd do if it were a person close to me. But, as I said earlier, that's what funerals are for. Not for the one who died, not for the glazed eyes at the wake, but for those closest. It's a final chance to say all they were never able to. A chance to reflect on the experiences they got to have. And most importantly, a head start in moving on.